Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo, Part 1, The Selection, by Jack Lee. It is difficult to be an ant. First, she is born with thousands of siblings and never has the opportunity to know her mother. Her father was a drone, whose sole purpose was to father thousands of siblings and, having fulfilled that purpose, is already dead. After birth, she is taken to a nursery, along with thousands of other sisters, where she is cared for by a nurse who is also her sister. It is in the nursery that an ant's dreams and desires will surface, and she learns what her purpose will be. She can be an attendant to the queen, carrying eggs and water and food back and forth from the royal chamber to the nursery. She can be a hunter, scouting the nearby area for the carcasses of dead animals and insects, or finding easy prey that could be harvested to provide the colony with food. She can be a worker, building the hill that houses the colony, carrying food for other workers, the nurses, the antlings, the queen. Or she can be a soldier, protecting the colony from invaders and occasionally doing a little invading of her own. But an ant that has the potential to be a queen follows a different path. She is removed from the queen's womb and taken into a special chamber where she is kept in isolation until she is hatched. After she is born, she is fed and stuffed until she develops a womb that will allow her to give birth to more ants and more sisters. Fail was to be a queen ant. She was removed from her husk and examined by nurses and experts in creating queens. She was chosen because her abdomen was especially large, and they thought she had a big mouth for them to shove food into. Fail was taken to a special chamber with other potential queens. She was waited on pincher and leg and came into her own self-awareness when she realized that she had outgrown the nurse who was bringing her food. If her size did not provide a hint as to Fail's uniqueness, the wings she developed did. She would sit in her chamber and flutter her wings and lift herself off the ground from time to time. She longed to have a little bit more room to test out her newly formed appendages in the open air. Fail was also taught different things than the rest of her sisters. Those of her sisters destined to only build the mound and gather food were taught a very simple language communicated by scent, antennae, and body movements. Fail was taught to communicate in much more elaborate forms that only fellow queens would understand. Someone would have to rule the hive when the queen neared the end of her days, and that someone had better be intelligent and educated enough to do it. One day, Fail was sitting in her chamber practicing the use of her wings when her nurse stopped by with Fail's daily ration of royal food. "Stay on the ground," the nurse said as she handed Fail her food and water. "You're going to tear up your room one of these days. You'll be buried under piles of dirt, and no one will be able to dig you out. You'll suffocate." "I'll be fine. Why have wings if I can never use them?" "You'll get to use your wings, but right now is not the time. Your only job right now is to eat." Nurses had to be practical creatures. They had the most sacred duty in the entire nest. The job of feeding the future queens was essential to the hive's survival, and not one that any nurse took lightly. "Will I ever get the chance to get out of this room?" Fail asked. She had never been out of her chamber since she was born, and she longed for some sort of freedom, or at least the opportunity to stretch her legs every once in a while. She knew very little of life outside of her chamber, but she knew there had to be more to her existence than her humble surroundings.
You will get the chance to leave sooner than you think, Vale.
Will I get to meet my other sisters?
You will get to meet some of them. You won't meet all of them. There are too many workers, soldiers, and nurses for you to become acquainted with all of your family. There are several thousand of us born each day. One simply does not have the time to meet them all.
I have other sisters called Nurse?
Only queens and future queens have names.
Your name isn't Nurse?
I have no name. I am known only by my station. I have no need for a name child.
Vale became saddened by the idea that her nurse, the only family or friend she had ever known, did not have a name. It seemed unfair to her.
Stop moping and eat up. You've got a big day tomorrow,
the nurse said.
What am I doing tomorrow? Am I leaving my room?
You are. Our Queen Mother has finally come to the end of her days and will select a successor.
Will I be the successor? Will I be the new Queen Mother?
Not if you don't learn some manners between now and then. It will be between you and all the other future queens that have been feeding all this time. If you make a good enough impression, you may have the opportunity to be the new Queen Mother.
Will I go outside?
The question humored the nurse. She knew that Vale, in her limited knowledge, did not mean outside the mound, a world of grass and sky and water and fresh air. She meant outside of her cell. Vale had much to learn about the definition of outside.
Yes, you'll get to go outside. And then some.
Nurse smiled the way an ant smiles, cleaned up after Vale and left. Vale spent the evening dreaming about all of the possibilities that would occur the next day. What would her mother be like? What would her sisters be like? Would she see other nurses? Would they be as kind and knowledgeable as her own nurse was? Vale fluttered her wings a few more times before setting down in her own chamber. She stared up at the ceiling and hoped that she would be chosen to be queen for the simple possibility of having more space to move around in. Vale was awoken with a start the next morning. Her nurse had tried to call her name over and over without success and had elected to squeeze in behind her and prod her along.
What are you doing?
Vale asked, sleepy and irritable.
I'm trying to get you to the Queen's chambers first, before the other potential queens get there. Maybe you'll have time to make a good first impression. The last egg is about to arrive.
I can move on my own. You could have just woken me up. And what is the last egg?
You aren't moving. You'll see when you get there.
Vale gathered her bearings and pushed her 6 legs as fast as they could move. She crashed headlong into the wall outside her door and caused some dirt to spill onto the floor. This caused nearby workers and nurses to shout and move from here to there, assessing and repairing the damage.
Vale, you silly, silly thing. You know you don't know where you are going,
Nurse said.
You told me to hurry.
The nurse moved in front of Vale and led the way through the twisting and confusing chambers through the mound. They did not have far to travel. The young antlings, like Vale, were kept close to the throne room where the queen dwelled, but it seemed like a long journey. Vale had never traveled anywhere before. She made her way through the winding tunnels, following her nurse and doing everything she could to keep up without causing any more damage to the walls and passageways. Vale did not want to be introduced to the queen as the one who destroyed the nest. They finally reached a long tunnel that, to Fail, seemed to go on for hours. She was surrounded in darkness as she approached the opening at the end of the corridor. She tried to picture what could be on the other side, but there was nothing that she could imagine in that brief moment that could satisfy her curiosity or curb her excitement. When she finally stepped through the opening, she looked up to see a ceiling stretching as far as anything she had ever imagined. She noticed a small cave located high above the floor. The walls were so wide that Fail could not tell whether or not the room had any boundaries at all. There was so much space. She marveled at the number of ants, which numbered so many that she had difficulty seeing the earth around them. Sisters upon sisters upon sisters. There were large ants and small ants. There were soldiers with scars who marched in time and attendants with cheery dispositions. She saw potential queens, just like her, being led around by their nurses, as she was. And in the middle of it all, sat the queen herself. The queen was the biggest ant of them all. She had attendants crawling all over her, delivering eggs and passing them to workers to transport them to the hatching rooms. She had servants cleaning up after her and bringing her food. There were also dark-colored, winged creatures that Fail did not recognize as being ants at all.
"What are they?"
Fail whispered.
"Those are the males,"
The nurse said.
"Don't pay them any attention."
The nurse led Fail into the middle of the chamber in front of the queen with all the other potentials. In the midst of the crowd of moving and scampering came a sudden stillness. No ant moved or breathed. All eyes and antennae were on the queen. A small worker ant emerged from behind the queen and walked toward the tunnel that Fail and the nurse had come through. She was carrying a soul egg. Fail had never seen an egg before, but she knew what it was. Everyone knew. The worker ant carried the egg with a measure of duty and sadness. She did not hurry or drag her feet. She moved with the knowledge that she had an audience of ants watching her every move. She walked through the group of potential queens and gave a slight nod of her head, the egg in her pincers gently bobbing in her mouth as she paid her respects to the future mothers of the nest. When the worker had passed through the tunnel, the room began to waken with movement and life again.
"The last egg has been delivered,"
a queen's attendant shouted.
"Let the selection begin."
Fail was one of a dozen other potential queens. They all varied in size and shape. Fail was slightly larger than the rest, but other than that, they were all the same. Indistinguishable from one another, to the foreigner's eye. Fail looked around the room to see how the selection process would take place. Maybe the queen would speak with each of them alone and determine which one would be the most worthy. Maybe she would just know instinctively by look and touch which one would be able to provide the healthiest eggs and continue on the lineage and tradition of the colony. Fail looked into the queen's face and wondered what she was thinking. But then the queen turned her head away and hid her face. Fail saw one of her fellow potential queens slam into the ground in front of her. She saw the ant's antennae moving and writhing in all directions. Fail gathered only one word from the ant's motions. Run. Fail looked at the dying ant in front of her. Her eyes traced her way up to her dying sister's back to see a soldier ant stabbing and tearing at the body's wings with her pincers. Fail looked around to see all the other potentials falling and gasping around her.
This is the selection process,
she thought.
They're going to kill us until only one is left.
Vale barreled her way to the middle of the group. She looked up to see dozens of soldier ants leaping into the air onto the group of potentials. She saw horrors that she had never imagined. Soldiers ripping potentials' legs off, grabbing their necks with their pinchers and thrusting their stingers into the heads until all that was left was a mushy substance. She looked up to see a soldier diving for her face and crouched down in time for her assailant to smash into another victim. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find some sign of her nurse. Her nurse would protect her, or at least tell her what to do and where to go. She scanned the audience of ants watching the selection process. She found her nurse's eyes. Vale hoped to see signs of terror, but instead, she found a quiet complacency. Her nurse just stood there watching the slaughter with a measure of pride that Vale's limited experience could not comprehend. She felt the walls of soldiers closing in on her. The other potentials fell around her one by one, crashing into the floor and dying under the stings and slashes of the colony's soldiers. Vale looked up at the ceiling, hoping to die with a vision of the endless space above the chamber as the last thing her eyes saw or her heart felt. But then, Vale noticed something. There was a small cave above the chamber. She had noticed it when she came in, but thought nothing of it at the time. She would never be able to fight through the soldier ants to crawl up there. She couldn't run, but she could flutter her wings. Vale began to beat her wings against her body as hard and as fast as she could. She launched herself into the air, raising her body above the carnage below. She had never practiced moving through the air, only lifting herself up, and she would have to learn how to steer herself through the air and reach the cave. There was no time for a learning curve. She looked in front of her to see a soldier make one last attempt to keep her from flying away. The soldier had used some of her colleagues as a springboard and leapt through the air to try to grab Vale's leg and bring her back to the killing floor. Vale moved her wings in every direction that she could until she finally shot forward and directed herself towards the cave. She looked down below to see the murder of her sisters, by her sisters, continue. When she reached the cave, she slid in and turned around to look down at the throne room below. The last of the potentials had been slaughtered, and all eyes in the throne room were on Vale. She turned her large body around and ran as far into the cave as she could. As Vale ran, she saw markings on the wall. There were etchings of pictures and scenes and words she didn't know how to read. She reached the very back of the cave and saw an image of a nurse with a large soldier standing over her. The soldier ant appeared to be nudging her for some reason. Vale heard a noise behind her before she could finish inspecting the drawings. She turned to face the cave's entrance. She knew that she could not go anywhere and would have to charge through whatever was coming through that passageway. She heard sounds in the darkness coming closer and closer. Every scratch of dirt or scurrying sound magnified and shook through Vale's antennae. Her body trembled. She imagined thousands of soldiers coming for her to finish the slaughter. Her selection. She didn't know what to do. Her nurse had never prepared her for a situation like this. Finally, a familiar sound echoed down the corridor.
Fail?
Fail recognized the sound of her own name, but it was a voice that Fail had never heard before. It was not the voice of her nurse, so who could it be?
Fail, it's all right. Everything is okay, it's over.
Fail peered warily into the darkness, hoping for some sign of familiarity, even though there was not much for Fail to be familiar with. Finally, a face appeared in the darkness.
Fail, it's okay. I'm your mother.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of Ants of Fire, The Legend of Telo, titled The Selection, an original novel by Jack Lee and produced by me, Jared I. McGee. Jack Lee is from the American South. He enjoys clean water, fresh air, and tall trees. He writes when time and sanity allow. All noises and musical tracks in the background of this story are from freesound.org. The sounds and the vast majority of the musical tracks are all being used under CC 1.0 Universal Public Domain dedication licenses. The more sustained strings theme here at the end comes from Nominum and is being used under an Attribution 3.0 unported license. For more music by Nominum, head over to nominum.bandcamp.com. That's nomenum.bandcamp.com. In the introduction, I'd said I'd only planned to release this one story this week, but the muses struck and demanded I release this second story along with the beginning of our Ants of Fire adventures. So please do stick around for Someplace, Somewhere.